Okay, yes, I see people coming in.
Yeah, okay, I think we're going to go ahead and get started and hope that all of our people upstairs who are enjoying the food and drink or will come down and join us for the reason why we're all here. Good evening, and thank you for joining us. We have people here, of course, in the theater, but we also have quite a few people joining us by Zoom. I'm Kate Markert, and I'm Executive Director here at Hillwood Estate Museum and Gardens, and my pronouns are she and her. I always like to begin by gratefully acknowledging the Nacotch tank. They're also documented as the Anacostan, the Piscataway, and the Pamunkey. And these are the native peoples on whose lands Hillwood now stands, as well as the diverse and vibrant native communities who make their homes near us today. We are so pleased to have audiences for tonight's program, both here in the theater and by Zoom. Now, for those of you in the theater, please be sure you've silenced all of your devices that will chirp and bark and, So please do that. And then for those of you who are joining us by Zoom, you can make yourselves comfortable. Your microphones are not active. We can't see you there in your jammies. So you may submit questions via the Q&A function on the Zoom menu whenever they cross your mind. And we will try to make sure we leave time at the end to get to all of your questions from both locations at the end. Now, those of you who are in the theater, if you would just wait for the microphone to come to you so that the people who are on Zoom can hear your question, that would be great. So tonight, our Great Homes and Gardens series continues with a special conversation with Jeanine Hayes and Bryan Mason, the authors of APHROCHIC, this beautiful book. And then it concludes next week with a lecture about the trailblazing architect Julia Morgan, who is, of course, best known for Hearst Castle. Our current exhibition is Marjorie Merriweather Post's Paris, which is open until June 16th. So I hope you will be sure to see it. And also join us next month for an exciting lecture about the Black and White Project and the Patterson portrait. That's the gorgeous portrait that's in the mansion in the pavilion. So if you aren't already a member, I encourage you to join today, and you can learn a lot about all of our offerings on our website, which is hillwoodmuseum.org. So I am so pleased to be joined tonight by Jeanine and Bryan to talk about their wonderful book, APHROCHIC, Celebrating the Legacy of the Black Family Home. And if you haven't already, I know you'll want to pick up a copy in the bookstore right upstairs, and they will sign it for you after the program. The images that you're seeing on the screen there are all from their beautiful book. In APHROCHIC, Jeanine and Bryan explore the Black family home and its role as a cornerstone of Black culture and life. There are 16 gorgeous house tours of actors and musicians, the studios of artists and curators, the offices of entrepreneurs and executives, and homes filled with pieces handed down from generations past. Woven beautifully throughout, urgent explorations of the roots of the Black home ownership gap shed light on the obstacles many Black Americans still face today. Recently, Jeanine and Bryan were interviewed about APHROCHIC by Robin Givhan at the Library of Congress as part of the 2023 National Book Festival. Marjorie Merriweather Post, the founder of Hillwood, saw the importance of preserving history and displaying it proudly and beautifully in one's home. And I am sure she would be a fan of this book as well. But of course, APHROCHIC is not only a book, it's also the name of Jeanine and Bryan's brand. Sorry.
Oh, no, it's fine.
are a design company. They run a magazine. They host a podcast. They're filmmakers and authors, and they have a collection of home decor products. There's nothing they don't do. APHROCHIC is dedicated to celebrating design, culture, and creativity throughout the African Black diaspora. The two are experts in creating experiences and telling stories about Black life at home. For over 15 years, APHROCHIC has been documenting the Black family home and Black contributions to the world of design through projects with HGTV, House Beautiful, and their own publication, APHROCHIC Magazine. They have worked with several Fortune 500 companies as content creation experts, developing national marketing campaigns, pop-ups, concept spaces, and experimental environments that focus on outreach to an African American audience. APHROCHIC has been featured on Good Morning America, Next Question with Katie Couric, NBC Open House, and has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal. So we are very lucky indeed to have them here with us tonight. Please join me in welcoming Jeanine Hayes and Bryan Mason. Okay, so let's get started by getting to know you a bit. Okay. Can you tell us more about both of your backgrounds and about the company, APHROCHIC, and how did the company and this book all come about? I mean, that's a lot to start.
But it's good to start. One, we're really excited to be here at Hillwood. It's really just a beautiful place, and as designers, it's very inspiring to walk through a space that has so much beautiful design that's here. And we're excited to be back in DC. So the sort of journey for Bryan and I has not been anything traditional. We're two kids who basically met on a college tour to FAMU. Neither of us went there, but we came back with each other. And that was
a good trip.
I don't even remember how, 20 some odd years ago?
It was 1996.
1996, so it was a long time ago.
I was 16 years old.
Yeah, he was 16, I was 17, and we started talking on the flight, and we just never stopped talking. This has been like almost a 30-year conversation. We lived here for a little bit. I went to law school at American, and then after law school, we moved to California, where Bryan was at Berkeley, and he got his master's in African American.
African diaspora studies. So I ended up with 2 master's degrees. I got one. My first master's degree was in systematic philosophical theology from the Graduate Theological Union, which is sort of like right next door to Berkeley. Then I crossed the street and went to Berkeley and got a master's degree in African diaspora studies.
So, nothing to do with design. What's happening at all. But I always loved design. It's always been something that's been important to me. I love decorating my room as a child and just, creating spaces. And so in '07, sort of the blogosphere was developing at that time. I don't think any of us realized the way that social media would grow to how it is now. But it was just really an outlet for me as a lawyer to have a little blog that was just going to talk about design. And Bryan encouraged me to kind of talk about my perspective. And as we started developing that perspective, he got more into it and brought in his African diaspora studies components. And we really, really developed APHROCHIC as a space where we could talk about Black contributions in the world of design. It has opened up to its own world of so many different things, but I think for us it really is about narrative, storytelling, and really showing what America looks like, and really telling the stories of the Black family in America and our contributions.
Yeah, really the development of APHROCHIC is coming out of a passion project for Jeanine that has become sort of like a passion and a mission for me. I will say absolutely, I came to this with no understanding of design, what it was, how it worked, and probably even less interest at the time. But as we've gone and I've learned everything I know about design, I learned from Jeanine. And so in that, we developed this approach to looking at it not simply as nice things arranged skillfully in a room, but as a cultural artifact. And so we started to ask ourselves the question, how does design function in culture? In what way does it become a lens, a reflection on the culture that created it? And how does it speak to the historical, social, political processes that make a culture and that make, what a culture is in a moment in time? And so from there, we started looking at, okay, well then, how specifically does it function in our culture? It became a way to speak to various aspects, not only of African American and African diaspora culture, but of how all of those cultures weave together and how they fit into sort of the larger tapestry of the world.
Wow. Well, what was your process for creating the book? How did you decide who to interview? I mean, because you must have had many, many options of people. And did you have a chance to really learn about their design processes as a part of creating the book?
Yeah, we started interesting, being like very, very honest, and just saying that Jeanine really wanted, after our first book, we did a book on sort of like African American culture and design, and she said she wanted to do a book that was entirely on house tours. And for me, it took a minute of not necessarily convincing, but there were things that I wanted to be sure about, things that I knew we needed to do, so that the book wasn't just sort of, here are 16 black people with nice houses, and knowing that the response would be, because there's a temptation there for people to go, okay, racism's over. Here are 16 black people with nice houses. We're done. Everybody can go home. And so we didn't want that to happen. And so it really became a process of saying, okay, well, how do we tell the entire story? Because we've observed and been not always thrilled with the way that our experience is divided. Either it's black joy or it's black suffering. But neither is our experience exclusively, and neither by itself is definitional of who and what we are, or who and what we've been to this point. So the real effort was, how do we tell the whole story? How do we bring these things together in a way to show the amazing joy that we get from home, and the way that we love it, and the way that we design it, and how the design's a reflection of that joy, but then also, how do we tell the rest of the story into the incredible hurdles, the huge obstacles and the ongoing suppressions that go into blocking black people from owning homes in this country, and what that means, and how those things all fit together, because when they come together, that's where the story is. That's where who we are.
Yeah, the process was interesting. Like you said, it was, it's 16 different families. Our home is in there as well. And a lot of people we just reached out to, we've known over the years, doing this work for over 20 years, folks that we've seen on Instagram, folks that we've known, and just kind of contacted them and said, we're doing a book, and, would you like to be involved? And, people were like, yeah, okay. It was the beginning of the pandemic. So honestly, it was amazing that people were so generous with letting us into their homes to shoot. But we didn't know the kind of stories that we were going to get. We just, for Bryan and I, again, we love talking to people. We love learning about people. And so we actually did a lot of Zoom calls with people and just sat down for an hour, 2 hours, and talked to them about not just what their home looked like. Because those folks that we did identify, we knew they had, really impactful spaces. But it was more about what home has been like in their story growing up. And so the first question, we asked them was, tell us about the home that you grew up in. And, we would get these amazing answers. People would actually just be thinking back, and a lot of people, it was about their grandparents. Sure. My grandmother, she would bring, had all the furniture perfect. They might have had the plastic covers on the chairs because she didn't want it to get, messed up. And people would remember things like, on Sundays we'd have to wash, the floors and all those things. But they became these really beautiful moments, because what we actually found in writing the book was that a lot of what we think of as home as we grow older comes from those foundational years. And a lot of us are actually recreating that home over and over and over again in our lives. And so it's also, we've learned it's so important, those first spaces that we grow up in, and how they kind of help us connect with our own internal home story and how that comes out in people's spaces.
And then in learning a lot of these stories, it was really about also finding out that we not only all have our own stories, but they all connect to history. So we spoke with people who were telling us about, ancestors who had been conductors on the Underground Railroad. We found out about people whose ancestors had been early pilots who actually ran private all-black flight clubs in California in like the 50s and 60s. So, all of these stories, it was interesting to see how many of them wove together. We saw, a lot of the footprints of the Great Migration, because all of us, at some point said, well, my family was here and then we moved. And then in that story, we started to see the ways in which the African American story reflects every aspect of the American experience. So, the idea of going back to, the Civil War and emancipation, and where black people have been refugees in this country, to the Great Migration, where people have been, essentially immigrants, where one brave person moves, and then they're responsible for finding a way to bring everyone else, and you have generations sleeping on the floor and, working in domestic jobs and things like that. Everything that we think of as being the immigrant experience, part of that experience has been there, but then also the experience of being legislators and entrepreneurs and business owners and all of the other amazing things that make up the diversity of our experience. So that was also very much a goal of the book, was to expand on what we tend to think of as being the black experience.
Well, that something you point out in the introduction to the book is that black homes as portrayed in media often fall into these common tropes, and your book showcases diversity in the black experience and the home. Can you expand a little more on that whole notion?
Yeah, this has become one of our favorite topics. We really like talking about this. Well, the tropes by themselves are familiar and fairly unremarkable. They divide the black American community rather neatly into the majority, who are expected to be less fortunate than your average white American, the minority, who are the celebrities, the black people who have nice homes because you've seen them on TV, because they act, sing, or play sports, and then that small remainder whose houses are simply normal, and with normal being the idea that as close as they possibly can be to the homes of white people. And so what's more intricate, more interesting than the tropes themselves are why we have them. And so whenever we're talking about tropes, essentially what we're talking about is the collective memory of America and the common knowledge. And so the question becomes, why do we choose to remember or not remember the black family home, what we call the black family home, in this way? And you can even put the idea of representation in there, because as it's sort of a developing trope itself, representation is incredibly important. But there's also an extent to which, though, it's become such a prevalent part of the conversation now, that it'd be easy to believe that the only reason black people ever marched, moved, or did anything was out of a need to be seen. And that's not quite the case either. So when we start to go into these things, we realize that the social injustice of the black family home, of its omission from the American story, is often there specifically to cover the economic injustice of the black family home. So we talk a lot about the Fair Housing Act and its signing, and its anniversary is coming up soon, in 1968. And at that point, the rate of home ownership for African Americans was hovering somewhere around 40%. And it was already on an upward trend. And you could see, because of things that were going on at that time, also the rate of media representation in things like film and television were also going up for African Americans. And they continue to go up until about 1980, which is the closest that the rate of African American housing, of home ownership, and the white American rate of home ownership have ever been. The gap was still massive, but it's never been smaller than that. At that point in the 1980s, things like home ownership, income, education stalled out. Representation continued, however. People continued to be seen until about the mid-90s, towards into the late 90s. Then African American representation, and any of us who've been alive through the 90s and hit 2000 knows they felt like we just kind of disappeared from TV, from everything. At the same time, around that time in the mid-90s, homeownership shot up. But that's because we had moved into the era of subprime mortgages, and black people were being targeted by predatory lenders. So that by the time we hit the 2000s, when everything crashes, it wipes out about 50% of black American wealth and untold numbers of homes, to the point where by 2019, the wealth discrepancy between white Americans and black Americans is 10 to 1. So for every dollar a white family has, an African American family on average had a dime. So these things continue to move, they continue to fluctuate. And there are times when, you know, media representation is up, but homeownership rates are down. And since by the time we hit 2020, the rate of homeownership was at the lowest rate it had been since the signing of the Fair Housing Act. And now it's rebounded somewhat, it's gotten to about 45%, but the rate of white homeownership is also at about 75%. So the discrepancy between them is about as high, actually it's a little higher than it was in 1960, before the Fair Housing Act was signed, before any of this happened. And so the reason why we have the tropes that we have in terms of collective memory is, what it comes down to essentially is that memory is the basis of future expectation. So if you remember, black people don't have nice homes, or there's no expectation, there's no reason to think that the fact that these homes aren't there is in any way strange. So no one ever asks. We don't ask about things like encultured bias in lending. We don't ask about the racism that goes into appraisal practices that undervalue homes that black people are trying to sell or overvalue homes that they're trying to get into. We don't talk about the fact that redlining is still a thing, even though it was supposedly outlawed by the Fair Housing Act. And so because we either represent or don't represent things in this way, because we push them into these easily digestible ideas, and because we don't really think about what the experience could be outside of this narrow lane, then one, we miss out on the full variety of what we know our experience to be, but also it makes it much easier for the society at large to digest, and to most importantly to continue perpetuating these cycles that, as long as they continue to come up with the expected result, we don't find it in ourselves to expect something else. So you never realize something's wrong. And one of the things we talk about in the book, we call that essentially the myth of happenstance. And so the myth of happenstance is when a series of overlapping oppressions essentially create a veneer of invisibility for each other. So if, you know, we know that there's education bias, we know that there's income bias. So even for people doing the same job, we know there are reports that come out every year, black people will make less money for doing the same job. But then when those things are taken either as proof of or proof that it's not a good idea to give a black person a home loan, or, you know, they're actually used to deny those loans or keep black people out of the homes that they want to be in, then they kind of create this, it's just expected. Okay, well, of course that's what's going to happen. We already know that this is not the way that these things should be.
You see why it's been a long 30-year conversation? He's really interesting.
Absolutely.
And it takes me a really long time to say anything, so that's why I say 30 years.
Well, what I loved so much about the book is how you integrated history throughout the book. And I just would like you to talk about why you felt it was so important, because you don't expect it in a book about beautiful homes. You don't expect these segments of history that are just so important for people to know about.
Yeah, that was really, in a lot of ways, that was why we wanted to do the book. So, you know, we wanted to really have this conversation about where does home start for African Americans and sort of where are we now. But we love at APHROCHIC to have these kind of conversations, but talk about it through a lens like design, because you can get more people to engage in that conversation rather than it just being sort of scholarly. So it was interesting because we definitely brought that to the publisher and was kind of like, we want to have these areas which we call the journey home.
Right.
And they were kind of like, I'm not sure, you know, if we can do that and how would that make sense? But they really did trust us with it. And one of the things that's so beautiful about the historical sections is the stories of the homeowners end up really dovetailing with the history. So like Bryan said, we have homeowners whose families were part of the Great Migration. And so that ties into when you get to these historical parts about the Great Migration. And so it really it tells the whole story. And that's really what was very important to us, was to tell the whole story, and not just the story of the joy and the beauty,
Right.
but the story of the experiences of our ancestors. And when we understand those stories, it really, to us, shows this incredible resilience that's a part of the Black experience here in America. That after emancipation happens, I mean, during slavery, there was no concept of a Black home. You were someone who lived on a plantation. You did not have an actual space that was yours. If you read, like, Frederick Douglass's narratives, he'll talk about that, the place that they lived was just didn't have a floor. There would just be the ground. It was very cold. So you just didn't have any warmth in those spaces. And when emancipation occurs, there is no place for people to go. Like, people, you don't really think about what happens in that period, but many people, the plantations, basically say, okay, we are, for a while, they weren't even saying okay. Some people were still enslaved. But when the government said you have to let people go, people would just be out on the street. And for many years in America, people were living out in the streets, like Bryan said, in refugee-style situations, and many people died. But the community still found ways to start towns. We think of, like, Greenwood in Oklahoma, and in Rosewood in Florida, and all these amazing Black communities that start. People are actually saying, okay, we're Americans, and we're going to build something for ourselves, our own communities, our own homes, our own spaces. Many of our ancestors were carpenters. Many of them had the ability to build because they were doing the work on the plantations. And then as we continue to look at this historical narrative, we see these communities, and we see, sadly, their decimation. But we see the Great Migration. People start over again. They bring family up north or to other parts of the country, and they start to build again. And even when we're hit, in 2008 by the subprime lending, which did wipe out a lot of Black homes, people still found ways to rebuild. And so I think that we were able to get the publisher and everyone to see with those chapters that whole story needs to be told,
Yeah,
and deserves to be told, because it is our story. It's an American story, and it's also an incredible story of resilience. And I love that for our community, we get hit, and it's not something that should be acceptable, but we keep going. We never stop building, and I want people to be proud of that, so that we understand, even when we hear those statistics and those numbers, we are still going to keep going, because that's who we are.
Yeah, we need to be able to understand the story for ourselves. I mean, when we write, our focus is always for, it's for everyone, but we're specifically thinking of speaking to our community for the things that we need to know and know about ourselves. So, like, I don't know, can I tell a story? Is that right?
Yeah.
Can I tell a story? All right. Let me tell you guys a story. So this is a story that's actually not in the book. So in the late 1800s, like around 1890, there was a guy named Edwin P. McCabe, who was in Oklahoma. If you watch that David Oyelowo show, there's like a version of him on that show.
Bass Reeves.
Bass Reeves, right. And so he's in Oklahoma, and he is trying to turn Oklahoma into an all-Black state. So he's buying up tons of land, and he's sending agents all throughout the South, trying to convince people to come and be a part of this land. And it's very rough. It's a hard life. It takes a long time to get anything off the ground, but eventually they establish the town of Lincoln, Oklahoma, and establish Lincoln University. And he wasn't the first person to try and do this. There was a senator who had tried to do it earlier, but it didn't work out. But McCabe, he was able to get this town started. And this is, Oklahoma in the 1800s, so exactly like right what we think of as being the Old West. And so he has these people out here. They're able to start this university. It's one of 50 Black towns that are created in Oklahoma between the late 1800s and early 1900s. Around that time, there's a newspaper that even said of the 25,000 people living in Oklahoma Territory, 15,000 of them are Black. So that was the population of Oklahoma at the time. The population of Oklahoma today is less than 8% Black. And those towns, there are only a handful that are still there. Lincoln is still there, but there's only a handful that still remain. And so when we ask the question, or when it ever comes up, who built America? Who was in the Old West? This is why we talk a lot about memory, and this is why we talk a lot about these tropes, because reflexively you think, Old West, I know what that is. Who built America? Well, who else? You know? And so because of that, we don't have, when we omit those parts of the story, when we skip over them, when we cut them out, when we take books out of classrooms, when we remove, you know, people from positions of power at, you know, prestigious universities, we create this environment in which it becomes very easy to forget these things.
Mm-hmm.
And so it becomes very easy to answer that question incorrectly, and it becomes part of what we call common knowledge. The things that you know without having to know how or why you know them. Well, I know who was in the Old West, and I know who wasn't. And I know who built America, and I know who didn't. But what happens is when you omit that, you end up with this continued image of Black Americans as people, perennial strangers, trying to make a home for themselves in a land that isn't ours. But when you actually remember the story, you're like, okay, this is a lot of how Oklahoma developed, and this is a lot of what was going on in the Old West. And you had guys like Bass Reeves and Edward Rose and a lot of other people out there. And when you start to remember these things, then things start to fill in. And it gets a little harder for somebody to make you feel like an outsider.
Mm.
It gets a little harder for them to make the argument that you don't really belong where you are. And so that's why for us it's very important to be able to tell the entire story all the way, because one of the other things that becomes very easy to assume is, I know why Black people don't have these types of homes. And we've had a lot of people, white and Black, ask us, and you know, I didn't know Black people had these kinds of homes. We've had people even in our community tell us, I didn't know that Black people could own these types of homes, which is why I've never tried to own a home. So it's incredibly vital that we continue to be able to have these conversations so that we know these things about ourselves, so as to change the ways in which we encounter the things that we currently encounter.
Mm. So true. It was really interesting to learn about the specific things that people display and keep in their homes. And of course, here at Hillwood, as you saw,
Yeah.
we're always learning about the history and the significance of objects that Marjorie Post kept in her home. Can you talk about what you found surprising or interesting in what people display in their homes, and which memories and stories from these objects really stood out for you?
Well, first I'm going to say, if you have not walked through
Ah!
the museum,
You need to.
yes, I mean,
Definitely.
just amazing.
Yes.
The number of pieces that she was able to amass, and all of it around specific concepts that
Yeah.
she was interested in. So it's really quite incredible. I think that one of the things that was interesting for us, again, was that idea that what you saw when you were a child still came back again and again for people. And when we would talk to people and talk about their story, they wouldn't even see it. And we'd be like, oh, well, you have this on your wall because your grandmother loved flowers, and you know, and they would be like, oh, I guess so. Like, wait, I didn't even put that together. But I think that the objects that people put in their spaces, and particularly in the Black family home, are reflective of memories, are reflective of our culture, are reflective of who we are. And I think that's what makes the Black family home so beautiful. It's just like what we see in our music, what we see if we're out on the basketball court, if we're whatever we're doing, you have to make it your own. Like, your mac and cheese and my mac and cheese are different, like, and they should be different. You don't have everybody in the family doesn't have the same recipe, and we love that individuality. We love putting our spin on a thing, and that's really what is happening in these homes too. People are putting their own spin on something and taking that cultural story through with them, that ancestral story through with them, in terms of the pieces they have in their home. So one, there's a picture I'll go by with a really eccentric house, and it's in Brooklyn. The artist's name is Paul Supat. He is Jamaican, and his grandmother raised him, and he said she used to sell these little flowers that she would make, little trinket flowers, and he would watch her make them. She would use reusable materials, recycled, upcycled materials to create them. And he has this giant like rose that's just this thing he made, and it's part of his living room. And then you'll go out into his garden, and there are these just whimsical floral statues and sculptures. And he was the person we were like, Paul, this is your grandmother. This is your grandmother. And that feeling that he got, when he would talk about her, the warmth, and that she was the person that helped him see that art was something that he could do and express himself. And he had created it all over his home without even realizing it. And so a lot of us do that. We bring those things in, not realizing that we're peppering our story and our legacy and our ancestry throughout our spaces. Because in particular, for Black Americans, home is really one of the only spaces where we can feel the most secure and safe. When you're outside, when you're at work, when you're, anywhere, you're having to be aware of microaggressions or actual overt aggression. So when you go home, the home is our story, and it's encapsulated there in just truly incredible ways. It was really interesting to see it, in the different homes, and also to reflect on it in our own home, how we were actually, playing out things of our own childhood in the design of our space too.
Yeah, and I would say that was one of the things that really stood out, was looking at what does design mean, in the African American community. And we're really glad that we had a little space to talk about that in this book, because, we would get the question fairly frequently, is there such a thing as Black design? Can there be such a thing as Black design? And our answer was generally, well, if there's Black food, Black dance, Black music, and if there's French design, Japanese design, Italian design, then yes, there can be a type of Black design. But understanding that it's difficult to be able to pin down exactly what that is, because, design in the Black community does not necessarily behave in the same way that design does for other communities. And what we realized, exactly what Jeanine was saying, was really design is a cultural artifact, and the emphasis that we place on design and the what we need it to be, because that's essentially what a cultural artifact is. It's a way of meeting a need, a human need that everyone has, and cultural artifacts are just our individual ways of meeting them. And so looking at, for Black Americans, the idea of like, well, what do we need from design? What do we need from our homes? And we broke it down into essentially 5 fundamental needs, which were safety, control, visibility, which I now think of as recognition, celebration, and memory as being the fundamental things that we need. And so when you talk about the vibe of the Black family home, that feeling that we all know, you know it when you have it, you miss it when it's gone, you know it when you walk into somebody else's house that has it, it's that instant recognition. It's because however it looks, or whatever individual form it's taking, we're designing to create these 5 things for ourselves. It's also a part of why, various Black homes can look so different but still have that same feel, is because if you're not decorating according to the style, you're decorating according to the need. Well, what's going to satisfy that need is going to be different for each one of us. And so that's why we have so many different looks. That's why there are so many different aesthetics. So looking at why we have that, and again, I'm sorry, y'all, we've been working on our magazine, so I'm just full of statistics tonight. But I was just reading about a study that was looking between 2015 and 2019, recognizing that even though since 2020 and the BLM marches, Black representation, particularly in film and television, has gone way up. Black people made up only 6% of directors and producers, and only 4% of writers. So even though it may look like representation is going really well, but in the wider scope of things, you're still seeing like these very, very disenfranchised numbers. And we know that of all the different media outlets that there are in the United States, only between, I think, 2 and 4% of them, 2%? Less than 2% are Black owned. And of the more than $1 trillion that gets spent on advertising, less than 2% of that goes to Black outlets, even as people are making pledges and saying, we're going to support this, support Black business, support diversity, support film and the arts, support DEI. And yet, none of that advertising money is going to the few outlets that are owned by black people, the few small black businesses that are dedicated to doing that work. So because of that, it creates an environment for us where we realize that the black family home kind of exists in two different ways. It exists as it is experienced for those of us who are in them, and as it is imagined by those of us who are not. And so we cling to the idea, like we vitally decorate our homes in these, unique and personal and narrative ways, because outside of our homes, there's basically nowhere else to tell our story. There's no place else that we can go to speak our truths fully and honestly and without pushback. As Jeanine talks about microaggressions, macroaggressions, because common knowledge in this country says anything a black person says must be instantly doubted. So when we talk about what our experience is, there's always but is it really? Is it really that bad? Was it really that rough? Did they call the cops on you that fast? Things like that. So, but when you're home, you don't have that. You don't have to fight for home. You don't have to carve out that space. You don't have to defend it once you have it. We say in the book, no one ever asks to touch your home. So you have the freedom there, the control to make the decisions you want to make. You have the visibility there. You have the recognition, not just visible, but recognized. What is it that you want to see on the walls? Who do you want to see when you come home? You can celebrate those aspects of yourself and of your culture that you're constantly defending on every moment you walk outside. And you have the space for that memory that when you leave your home, 3 tropes. That's all you get. Anything else you're going to have to fight for. But when you come home, you can be everything that you are. You can remember everything that you know and everything that everyone who came before you knew. I remember one of my professors at Berkeley, and actually it wasn't one of my professors, a professor visiting my department from another department, and was so overjoyed to be in the African Diaspora Studies department because she actually told us, for the last 4 or 5 years, I feel like I've had to leave my blackness at home when I come to work. And that's not a rare or an uncommon experience for anybody. So we know that, but when you go home, that's your space. And so, should it be that way? No. But one outgrowth of, as Jeanine says, we take our hits in our community, but we always keep going. And one of the ways that we've kept going is by developing what's actually a rather amazing interior design culture.
Mm-hmm. Well, it sounds to me like you're sort of talking about this already. Mm-hmm. But how has the concept of home changed for you over the years as you've worked on this project?
I think, home is, it's always changing and evolving. And I think for all of us now, as we're sort of in this sort of pandemic era, I think home has changed again. Before the pandemic hit, we were living in Brooklyn, and that was like home. Like that was, that was probably the first place we had moved that we were like immediately, like the first day we were like, no, this is it. We'll be here forever. Like we love it so much. And it just felt like us and the community that we were in was very supportive, and it was just fantastic. And we thought we would never not live in the city. But then when the pandemic hit, Bryan was one of the first people in New York to get COVID. So it was like before they even knew what COVID was. He was going to the doctor with like a
distinction.
Double pneumonia, and they're like, but he's a perfectly healthy young man. How could he be this sick? And it took us a while to figure out what had happened. And I got COVID and didn't know what would happen. I thought I had a stomach bug, and it ended up being COVID. And I have what people may hear now is called long COVID, which is basically, we're still understanding that, but it's been 4 years of major disabling things happening to my body. And so we had to leave the city. And so that was really hard. It was like, how are we going to leave New York? That doesn't make sense. We moved upstate. And now, when we lived in Brooklyn, home to me was honestly the city. You know, it was the city, it was the experiences, it was staying out late, and going out and seeing friends and hearing music and art everywhere. And, you know, it's just, you can absorb it all the time. And now home to me upstate is health, is wellness. We have a wellness space in that because I have to do physical therapy daily. It's quiet, and it's just being able to be safe.
Yeah.
And I think that in some ways the notion of home hasn't changed because it's always been that search for safety. When we asked people, what does the Black family home mean to you? We asked every person who participated in the book, what does it mean to you? Every single person said safety.
First thing.
The first thing they said. And that was how we felt too. And
Right.
so, you know, as we say pandemic refugees, home now is about safety. And it's also about having a place where we're open to think. You know, we do so many things because we love to think and we love to create. So our home now is a space that just kind of cultivates that ability for us to be as creative as we want to be, to read a lot. We read a lot of Du Bois and Frederick Douglass and, you know, Zora Neale Hurston, people who have done such incredible work, and we want to contribute and hope that
Sure.
we're doing that too. But the notion of home, I think, is constantly in flux and changing now in our world. But I do think that the central thing of home and that central component is it lives within us.
Yeah.
It really isn't about any particular place or a building. We actually create home, and we create it again and again as we grow. And so you find as you grow older that it just becomes this place that you take with you as you journey throughout life. And that can be all the little things. It can be things your grandparents said. It can be going into a space like this, because I was a little afraid in the museum. I mean, it's amazing, but there are so many beautiful things, and you're like, I don't want to touch something or mess something up. And you can almost hear like your parents or grandparents, don't touch that, you know, or like, you know, like, so you feel those things. They're with you, you know, all the time. And I think that what we hope is that when people read this book, that they're inspired
Right.
to create that for themselves. We were speaking to some of the ladies here when we first came in, and we're talking about that, you know, in the social media world right now, everything is about perfectionism. You know, you even see, someone else was saying they see these AI spaces and, you know, things that are not real or things that are manicured in such a way that everyone feels like they have to achieve that. And that's not home. You feel it. You feel when you look at it, it doesn't feel exactly right. It doesn't have that warmth to it. You know, we need to be able to feel free to create spaces that reflect us, make us comfortable, put paint on the walls, whatever color that you want, bring things in that you enjoy and that tell your story, rather than thinking that somebody's Pinterest or their Instagram account should be what your space should look like. So we really do hope that people also embrace that home is personal and is sacred in a lot of ways, and that we should respect that when we're creating our spaces.
So I'll say everything that she said. And on top of that, I would say that home has also become, over the course, and especially the course of writing this book, we've been working on home for a long time, but especially over the course of this book, home has become this source of endless fascination. And the reason being because, you know, as a kid growing up, I'm from Philadelphia, Jeanine's from just outside Philly, but we both grew up in families where everyone had houses. And so we didn't think about houses. Houses were just what everyone had. And then there were some people in our family or friends, whoever, who had apartments, and we didn't really think about that either. Now we look at home as being this very interesting, this incredible nexus point of so many different things. You know, we are constantly widening the lens of home to look at it as not only a cultural reflection, but also as a way of viewing culture. So one of the things we do with our magazine is really about making that lens wide enough that we can actually go through it and recognize that home is where you experience fashion and literature and music and art and economics and politics and all of these other things. And so they not only create the context of your home, but they also impact the life that you lead within them. And so through that, we're able to look at all of these things as, you know, part of you know, how we are seeing home, and the feeling of the ability to be at home in a space. At the same time, it's become a cause because we realize and we recognize not only the inherent problems with the rate of black home ownership in this country, but also with the constant sort of unceasing effort to prevent black people from having homes in this country, which again goes back to everything we were talking about tropes and concepts and collective memory and the idea of who is allowed to be at home in this country. And so, as we said, there's the intangible, there's the social injustice of it. But on the other hand, there's the very tangible, there's the economic injustice of it, and the understanding that over the course of American history, inheritances, and intergenerational gifts of wealth, which have been largely made up of the transfer of houses, has made up as much as 50% of wealth over the course of American history. So that wealth gap that we were talking about before is predicated largely on the housing gap. And so the reason why we have, again, these little tropes is because as long as you are conditioned by memory not to ask why there aren't black people in these homes, then you're automatically conditioned to accept the outcomes of something that you already told, you already thought that this is what it was going to be. And so we've looked a lot in understanding that what we ultimately need is, the Fair Housing Act, as we said, it was, the rate was around 40% when it started. It's, 2019, it was basically back to where it started. And the only time it ever really, really shot up is when people were being given bad loans that ultimately led to them losing their houses. So part of the problem with that is that, the compromises involved in passing the Fair Housing Act basically took a lot of the enforcement out of it. There's really not much oversight. There's really not much enforcement to it. There's no, to my knowledge, and I could be wrong, so please forgive me if I'm wrong, but from what I know, there's no housing subcommittee on, in, the House of Representatives. So these are things that we need. There need to be, we know that we have systemic problems.
Right.
We need to start creating systemic solutions so that when people do experience racism in the appraisal process of their houses, and we've heard stories even in other talks like this of people saying, I had to take all the pictures of myself out of my home and get one of my white friends to sit there when the appraiser came so that I could get a better price than I had gotten the last time I had someone come through. And it works.
Awful.
We need for there to be, mechanisms, because they exist, but they're, number one, no one knows about them. Number two, even if you tried, it would take you 50 years just to get shrugged shoulders from whoever you would complain to. But there needs to be someone that you can talk to about that without going, but are you sure it was racism? Are you sure that they came?
Right.
Are you sure it's because you're black that they did this with your house? So there are a lot of things that need to be addressed and need to be addressed with more than, hand-wringing articles and, expressions of sympathy. We need to address that this is a thing that we do. We need to address why it is that we do it. We need to accept that that's unacceptable. And we need to start reimagining ways to do things that aren't what we're doing right now.
Yeah.
And
Absolutely.
so that's, a lot of what the work that we're hoping to see done.
Well, I want to give all of these good people an opportunity to ask you questions.
Yeah.
I've been asking you all the questions up till now. So, questions from the audience or questions from Zoom? Yes,
And wait for
ma'am.
Sydney, she's going to bring the mic.
I feel like I have it.
So black people have a long line of history. Everyone used to be black, actually. Did you know Eve's mitochondrial DNA was actually found in Africa, which means we all actually came from an African ancestry. But a lot of people has hid that history from us for a long time. How can we change that?
That's a great
Rid of
question,
it,
Ishara.
That would be,
I
You're
was
the
gonna let you.
scholar. Yeah.
Okay, I can, okay.
that's your point.
Well, Ashara, thank you again for a great question.
Yeah.
I love talking to you. I always get such good questions from you.
Yeah.
Always, there's a lot of different things that we can do. I mean, number one, we can read books. There are a lot of books that are out there on topics like this. There are places where the history is out there. Sometimes it can be a little interesting because one of the barriers you'll run into is when you do find like a really good book on something on Black history, it's like $300 or $400 on Amazon, whereas so sometimes it's still placed a little bit out of reach, but we can read those books, we can do our research, we can write those books, and I'm really looking forward to seeing all the books that you're going to write.
Yeah.
So
Yes, I think definitely, like you said, writing books and sharing, right? It's about dialogue, just like this today. Really sitting down and talking with people about these different histories and making sure that all of our stories are able to be told. So the more that we share, the more that we become truth tellers, the more that we all allow our experiences to be at the table. And if we can't be at a table, then make our own table. Those things are critical and so important because the thing is that I love about America is it is so diverse. And it is not something that's bad. It is our strength. It is beautiful.
Absolutely.
All these different amazing stories that are here. And so we need to tell them. And we've all kind of been forced into this place of feeling like we all have to become smaller and not tell who we are and not talk about, what all of our different families went through to come here. And so I think that we need to stop being small and really embrace the totality of our stories and embrace that history too. So I want to hear more about that, Ishara. And like Mr. Bryan said, I can't wait to read your book one day.
Yep. I feel like I've been facing the wrong way this whole time. Not the wrong way because of the conversation, but I feel like I can look at everybody now.
Hello, my name is Adrian. This is my partner, Selena. This was a big shock to both of us because we looked at each other, but I really want to hear more about this because we actually just recently graduated this past spring from FAMU, and that's how we met.
I saw y'all.
Yeah.
So yeah, I would definitely love to hear more about this story if you would like to share.
Oh, the
Okay.
FAMU.
Oh, the FAMU story. Okay. All right. I tell the story. So, so yeah, it was like 1996. We were both seniors in high school, and I was going on this tour. It was a gentleman at my church who actually ran, college tours to Florida A&M. And I was around that time. I had no idea where I was going to go, what I was going to do. So I was like, sure, Florida, why not? So, and also my mother really wanted to go because she loves Florida. It was just like a week in Florida. So she was like, she just wanted to jump on the trip. So in my family, and this is way before TSA, but even at that point, like my father's idea of on time for your flight was like 3 days ahead. So we had been sitting there for God only knows how long, and I just wasn't, how you just space out. It's the airport. There's nothing going on. And I'm gonna be honest, I saw this young lady walk by, and I've been there long enough. You kind of had a sense for, it's a college tour, so who's on the trip and who isn't. So I saw her family come in. They kind of looked in the direction of where we were all sitting at the gate, and immediately went the other way. So, and I saw where they went. They went to this little restaurant. They were going to have, I later found out brunch is a big thing for the family. I did not know this at the time, but it's so, there was no stopping them. Like it had to happen. And so I'm sitting there and I'm going, is she going to be on this tour? Is she not? Are they about to miss this flight? And so I guess it was opposite day for me. So I got up and I was like, well, I decided to ask, are you coming on this flight? And they said, well, yes, we are. And I said, okay, well, they're just about to close the doors. So, we should go. And so they came, we got on the plane, and I noticed that Jeanine was sitting by herself. There was nobody else in her row. And I also noticed that she was basically digging her fingernails about 3 inches into the seat
My
rest.
first time flying by myself. So I was so scared.
So again, since clearly it was already opposite day, I was like, well, we can go over and sit down and talk to her. So, and that was really how the conversation started. I sat down and, I guess I already had hey, I'm the guy from the restaurant that told you were going to miss the flight. And we talked that whole flight. We kept talking trip. As soon as, and we were pretty inseparable, like from that point. So from the moment we met, we were together. And it was kind of funny because there were all these people, it was a college tour. So, everybody get booed up on a college tour, So, and so we had, all of the adults, all the chaperones, except for my mother. No idea where she was. But, so she was all having a good time. But, all these people were just like, y'all are not going to know each other once this tour is over. Stop sitting so close to each other. You're not going to be together. You're like, you're going to go your way, she's going to her and all that. And so Jeanine really wanted to try and find all of them and invite them to our wedding.
And to be like, they didn't know, they didn't know. But yeah, it was just that. And my mom, who's here, she says that when she dropped, when she went back after dropping us off at the airport, that she said that's going to be her husband. So she knew immediately. So and and it's just been fun. So I love seeing you all hold hands.
Yeah.
Keep that going, and life will be perfect.
Yes. Keep that energy.
Thank you so
I'm going to
much.
jump in with a question from Zoom. Someone would like to know if the act of reaching out to the homeowners to be part of this book, did this impact the way that they designed their homes or approached designing their homes or the things that they had in their homes for this specific project?
That's a good question. I'm going to ask, and we'll definitely get to you after. I'm sorry, I know you have the mic. That was interesting, that process of talking with people about coming to their homes. People were very open and wanted us to come to their space, but at the same time, right before our shoots, we had a lot of people who were panicked and actually went through just panic attacks. And we actually weren't sure what was happening because we've produced house tours for HGTV. We've done that for 15 years. And so call someone up, hey, we're coming to your house. We're going to come do a shoot. They're like, yeah. And you just go in, you're going to do it. Sometimes they need a few months, whatever, to get things going. So we had to really analyze what was going on. We were like, God, people they said they wanted to be in it, but now they don't want to be in it. Like, what's going on? And so we had a lot of conversations. And in the conversations, people would say, well, my house doesn't deserve to be in a coffee table book. Why would I be in a coffee table? And do I have to get my home ready in a certain way, or I got to bring in product? And we were just like, no. We want your home to be you. So none of these spaces were created for the book. This is basically how everyone in this book that you see, this is how they live. This is their home. Some are designers, some are artists, some are actors, some are, doing all different types of things, but this is their real spaces. And we had to talk with people and say, you definitely deserve to be in a book. Why wouldn't you? And your story should be here. So that was something that we didn't expect. And it was a lot of just really forthright, just honest conversations. Sometimes people were crying. Sometimes people were, I don't know how I feel about this. But on the other side, once the book came out, all the homeowners were so proud, and they were, getting it for all their family. And one of my favorite stories is our friend John Goodman. He's not the actor, but John, he's an event designer, and he grew up in the Bronx. He grew up in public housing. So part of that, when talking to him, he was like, well, I don't really know if my story fits. I grew up in public housing. We were like, home is home. That was your home. That's where you grew up. And he said that at the holidays, when he had the book, they were going through, the adults were looking at it and reading it, and they were excited. And they were talking about their ancestors had been enslaved. They actually know the plantation where they were from, and they actually bought the land. So his family owns now the land that they were enslaved upon. And they were talking about this, and the kids in the room were going, what? We were slaves? What are you talking about? Like they hadn't heard this story. They hadn't heard the history. It hadn't been shared. And so they actually brought the book out, and they had the kids sit. And he said, we just read together the story in the book. And then we started talking to the kids about the story, and they learned more about the family history, and it became this beautiful moment of sharing. So there was anxiety, but what I think is beautiful on the other side is people have started to become proud of their stories, and they wanted to share. And that is something that we didn't know was going to happen, but we're so happy that it did.
Absolutely.
Let's
We
go
have
to this
one
one.
right here. Yeah.
Thank you for all of this, and also thank you for sharing your love story. I'm curious though, for those of us who have not yet found love,
I love that this is turning into
but plan to, what tips do you have for sort of creating a joint home, right? When you have your family story, you have your ancestral story, they have their own, and even to make it even more challenging, what if that person is of a different ancestry? And how do you kind of find recognition and appreciation of multiple cultures within a home?
Yeah.
Right.
You want
right.
to talk about Danielle and Dennis?
Yeah. So actually, we have an example of that in the book. So, and it's actually one of the spaces that we designed. So we had a couple, and she was from the South,
Carolina.
from South Carolina, and he was of Haitian ancestry. And so they were kind of asking the same question. The big thing, first off, everybody has to want to be part of the process. You have to want to, you have to want to see each other reflected in the space. But really one of the things that we focused on is what we started calling, multivalent design. And so that was, for us, being able to find individual elements that spoke to both of their cultures simultaneously, but in different ways for each of them. So, for example, she grew up with a big, tree behind her house, and she remembered that, every time she came home, that big tree, it'd be the big tree, the house, and then behind it was the woods. And so that was how she remembered, all of those things. And for him, what was important was, he grew up in Brooklyn, but his family was Haitian, and so he remembered, all of the greenery and how lush it was the first time he went to Haiti. And so being able to include things like, whether it was actual plants or even just a certain color of green, to her it spoke to...
It's that space there.
Right, it's this space right here. And so another thing was actually this piece with the head wraps. And saying, well, whether you're talking about South Carolina or whether you're talking about Haiti, and one of the beautiful things about this, and we actually have a pattern that we make called sisters, which is women in head wraps facing each other. Because anywhere in the diaspora, you're going to find sisters in head wraps. And so these two women, one of the things we loved about that space is that they could be from anywhere, and they're facing each other and recognizing each other, recognizing themselves in each other. And which is essentially the process that you're talking about, this ability not only to speak to different cultures, but to actually also recognize yourselves in each other. And we did the same thing at another project that we did once where the husband was of Jamaican ancestry, and I think the wife was, European American, I think, with French ancestry. And so it was really about finding ways to blend things like, we put a lot of her culture into some of the furniture styles, and, when we were doing things like painting the walls, we found this really interesting shade of purple that changed colors as sunlight hit it differently throughout the day. And for us, it was kind of personal because, again, another part of the love story, we got married in Jamaica. And so we remembered, the sunrises, the sunsets, and this sort of amazing color of purple that the sky would turn. And growing up there, he remembered it too. So being able to put that color on the walls that spoke to his culture, and it working perfectly with, certain styles of dining room furniture or, actually some heirloom pieces that she had been handed down, were all ways that we were able to blend those things together. So there's a lot of really good ways to do it.
We have time for one more in-person question.
Oh.
So I'll ask, my friend had to leave, but her question was, if someone's interested in transitioning from one career into design, what's your recommendation? Because she actually is in the medical field, but she's really excited about design. So that's the question, and I'll relay the answer. But for me, I just want to really make a comment to Hillwood. I've lived in this area for 15 years. The last time I was at Hillwood was about 10 years ago, and I enjoyed it, but I didn't really feel all that welcome. But this time I do, and I had a chance to go through the mansion, and I just, in response to the young lady who asked, how do we tell stories, it means a lot to me personally to feel like this place now is including our story. So and I've already signed up for the next lecture. Olivia here has already told us about some other events. I don't know what the conversation has been over the last decade, but I'm actually now thinking about becoming a member. And again, 10 years ago, I didn't feel that way, so thank you. But anyway, the answer
That's
to my
beautiful.
friend's question, what does it take to transition? Like, if she's in the medical field, she's really interested in what you do. So any tips she would appreciate. Thank you.
Yeah.
And congrats to you guys, because
Yes.
that tells so much that someone would, say that and feel that.
It
I think
means a
that's
lot.
Yeah.
Amazing. I don't know what your friend does in the medical field, so I mean, it becoming a designer. I'm trying to think of the best way to answer this, because it's something that you could go to school for, and it's not an industry that you're going to make as much money if you're a doctor or something like that. But I think that what's been interesting is a lot of people have that design gene without ever going to school for it. I do think it depends on what you want to do. Some people have had some incredible design school experiences. Howard has an interior design program, which is fantastic. But sometimes you can go into some schools that you can feel very ostracized and not really feel like your perspective as an African American is totally welcome there. But I do think, I would probably say at this point, if your friend has that love and desire and she wants to start design, to start building a portfolio. If she's worked in friends' houses, if she's done something in her own place, begin to, get pictures and imagery of that, utilize social media. We always say it's a free tool, so you can go on Instagram and start putting your portfolio up there and seeing if there are other people that gravitate and say, hey, I'd love to hire you. I'd love to, have you help on my space. And then start that way. I wouldn't say leave one career and go straight into design, because it really isn't as lucrative. If you're a woman, you make less. If you're a person of color, you make less. And so you really need to build to a place where you can feel comfortable transitioning into something else. But I also say for people who aren't interested in school, and maybe you just are great at it, to feel free to open and explore that. And to, design is all about engagement and culture and fabrics and art and all these things. Go to museums, go see this collection, because if you're a designer, I was just thinking that, like, I hope you guys get lots of interior designers here, because this is so inspiring to walk through spaces like this and start to find your voice as who are you going to be in the design world, so that you have something to give to people that's going to be distinctive, because that's also very important. There are a lot of people that can put a space together, but what is your perspective so that someone wants to hire you and bring you in?
Yeah, I would say that, we ourselves did not go to school for design. We told you what we went to school for. There is no design involved in that. So it would be difficult for us to say that, like, school is the way, or, that's the only way. Obviously, and in some ways there are a lot of advantages to not going through the formal training, like with anything, Sometimes it's a little easier to break the mold, to break the habit. But I can say, in terms of what we did do, and a lot in terms of what Jeanine was saying, but one of the things we had going for us was the benefit of a blog. And so when we started, we didn't go, okay, we're interior designers. We really just started by writing about design. The idea was to, shine a light on, Black and brown presence in the industry, just period. But over the process of that, and this is what Jeanine was saying about finding your voice, it's great to have a Pinterest board, and I highly recommend that. It's great to have an Instagram where you just kind of go in and say, here's what I'm liking in design. But what's really advantageous, what really helped us, was having to write and say, here's what I like about this and why, or here's why I'm focusing on this, because that's really where we started to hone our design voice. So we actually didn't become interior designers until after our first design book. So we were approached by a publisher that had seen our blog and said, well, this is really great. Do you want to write a book? And so we were like, yeah, sure. But it wasn't until after that we started to think, this is something that we can actually do. But because we had spent so much time honing that perspective and that idea and that voice through the book, through the blog, and then having to take the step of going, okay, how are we going to fill a book with this? By the time we walked into our first empty room, which was a 3,000 square foot empty warehouse space at a design district in LA. And they were like, okay, you can take whatever you want from all the different stores that are here. And it was like Room and Board and Buttercup and all these other, and they had art stores and antique rugs and all that. And they said, just fill this space. And we wanted to look like, you know, we said we're going to do a modern California African-American home. So, but by the time we were standing there in an empty space with nothing, you know, we still had an idea of what it was we wanted to say. Not because we had designed 1,000 spaces before, but because we had spent so much time writing. So I think, you know, as you're trying to figure out what the conversation is and what you specifically have to bring to it, makes it so much easier when you do start to say, okay, and it makes it easier for all the different little business things that you don't know you're going to need. Like, how do I present my brand? How do I explain to someone what I do so that they come to me instead of someone else? Because as Jeanine said, there are a lot of people who can set a room. So all of that is really helpful, and it's so much easier to do now with social media, but it's easy to skip over the writing part now with social media. So, but that's the thing I would really say to emphasize.
Thank you so much. Please join us in the lobby for a book signing. Thank you all.
Yay.
Thank you so much.
Oh,
So
it's my great
fantastic
pleasure.
conversation.
Thank you so much.
I'm so glad to see so many people here, and I love that woman's comment.